This video will be a first in a series covering Chapter 11, Prosocial Behavior, asking the question, why do people help? In this first video, we'll be covering Learning Objective 11.1, describe the basic motives that determine whether people will help others. When we ask this question, what are the basic motives that affect people's decisions to help, we have to go from one extreme to the other. On the one hand, sometimes people help in ways that appear to be purely altruistic, meaning they don't care about their own needs or interests, they're just helping another person or people. On the other extreme, people are doing helpful things, but they're doing it for self-serving reasons. So we need to explore both of these polar opposites and everything in between. The first thing we want to consider is the connection between what psychologists call prosocial behavior, which is basically a fancy way of saying helping behavior, distinguishing between that and altruism. And you might be asking yourself, why do we need to distinguish between the two? And partly it's because there's this philosophical debate. Some philosophers and psychologists, for that matter, argue that it's impossible for human beings to be purely 100% altruistic. There's always some kind of interest, some sort of self-interest involved in behaving prosocially. So let's start with some definitions. Prosocial behavior, as it's defined by social psychologists, is any behavior done with the goal of benefiting another person. And that's regardless of whether it benefits the actor or not. Altruism, on the other hand, so prosocial behavior, just to underscore the issue, it's behaving helpfully regardless of any kind of motive. So it doesn't matter why people are doing it, they're just doing it. Altruism has a very specific definition. It's the desire to help others or another individual, even if it costs you. And let's face it, any kind of behavior that you engage in has costs. It also has benefits. Purely altruistic behavior is assumed to have costs, but no benefits. And it really is a philosophical argument. Now, another part of this philosophical debate is, are non-human species capable of purely altruistic acts? And again, we could debate this up one side and down the other, and that's why social psychologists have just decided, let's just stay out of the debate and just talk about prosocial behavior. So any behavior, regardless of motive, that is designed to benefit another. Now, I give you this little video clip, mostly because I think elephants are amazing, but also because elephants are a species that has a documented history of showing prosocial acts. Now, a lot of them are in kinship groups because elephants live in kinship groups. They tend to be related to one another. So there are also, as we'll explore in the next slide, evolutionary reasons for this kind of behavior. But here's a classic example. So what you see here is a group of elephants, and you have a younger elephant is going to make a mistake. There's a little baby elephant, and the little baby elephant has gotten in the water because water is super fun, but now it can't get out. Now the older elephants immediately respond to the baby elephant's distress. They try to give it encouragement, little nose job there, encouraging the little baby elephant to climb its way out, but it can't. So there you have a vocalization saying alarm, alarm, and then some more of the troop members in the elephant's group come to try to help, to try and find some solution. Eventually, the big mom arrives. Some of the bigger elephants arrive. These are more senior members of the group. Now everybody's a little upset. So eventually, one of the bigger elephants, this looks like a younger elephant, goes in, tries to scoop up the baby elephant and help him get out. That's not really working either because baby elephant is stuck under bigger elephant. Eventually, They figure it out, though. They come up with a plan, and everybody's watching, except for this guy in the front, who's like, hey, I'm just going to drink water because this is none of my concern. But the rest of the elephants, the older ones, they're very concerned about the baby, and they're going to gently keep moving the baby to a location where the little one can actually make it out of the mud before it gets in worse trouble. So they just, two of them, they've teamed up. We're just going to guide the baby, silly baby, out of the mud and onto dry land again. Now, you've probably seen countless examples of things like this. This is a high effort kind of activity. You can see it in elephants. You can see it in people. Now, evolutionary psychology, you're familiar with this. We've talked about it in other chapters. This is the type of theory that is really not designed for explaining individual behavior. It's designed for explaining the behavior of the species. So the idea is you need to zoom out, look at the species as a whole as it has evolved over time, and say, why would the human species or any other species like elephants, why would that species evolve the capacity for help-giving behaviors, for prosocial behavior, in other words? And there are some clear advantages. So social behaviors in general, whether it's helping behavior or not, they're going to explain social behavior in terms of evolutionary advantage and the principles of natural selection. So any gene that's going to enhance your survivability is likely to be passed on. The argument is that prosocial behavior is going to be passed on because it has advantages for survival of the genes that you all share in your various groups. Now, humans tend to be very social. What that means is, in our social groupings, we tend to share some genetic material with the people who are around us. In our family groups, in our kinship groups, in our even larger communal groups, we tend to live surrounded by people with a fair amount of similarity to us. The argument is that you will be more likely to help individuals who share your genetic complement. And by doing so, you're ensuring that at least some of your genes survive to the next generation. Now, again, evolutionary psychology does not do a good job of explaining individual decisions to be helpful. What it explains is the behavior of large groups over long periods of time. So let's look at some of these smaller elements. Kin selection, and you gotta love a picture of a meerkat. Kin selection involves behaviors that are exhibited that favor other individuals who share more and more of your genetic material. So with these meerkats, they live in family units. They live in packs. They tend to be related to one another, and they have these social organizations where some of them operate as lookouts and warn all of the rest of them that predators are on the way, that there's some kind of danger, and they will alert the whole colony. That's one example of how evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists talk about kin selection. So with people, with humans, there's a great deal of research out there that talks about the fact that when people are asked, they are more likely to report that they will help people who are genetically connected to them. You know, if you think about the circles of connections that you have tight connections to immediate family, and then you have another circle of somewhat more distant family, and then really, really distant family, and then farther and farther and farther out. When people are asked to rank order those relationships in terms of who they would help most and how much help they would give, people tend to say that they are significantly more likely to help people who are closer in genetic connection to them than other people. So they're going to help their genetic relatives more often and with more depth than non-relatives in whether it's a life or death situation or something more mundane. We also have a load of anecdotal evidence, so not from experiments, but from real emergencies, which tends to show that we tend to gravitate toward an assumption of help being given to people who are biologically connected to us. Now, that's not always the case. As I've said before, evolutionary psychology arguments like kin selection theory, it does best at explaining large groups. So if you look at all humans and survey data, if you're looking at a very large sample, yeah, it's going to show that pattern that we are significantly more likely to help our genetic relatives than people who are not connected to us genetically. At the same time, you probably have ample stories that you could tell of helping someone who is very, very different from you and shares no genetic material. So you have to remember, these evolutionary arguments are big picture, large numbers of the population over long periods of time. So what about some other factors that are kind of drivers in our decision making about helping in social situations? One of the most powerful is something called the reciprocity norm. And this is basically the expectation that helping others will increase the likelihood that they will help you in return. It's part of the human kind of social contract for us. Now, here's a funny example from the TV show The Big Bang Theory.
Okay, well, thank you for that, but I got you and Leonard a few silly neighbor gifts, so I'll just put them under my tree.
Wait. You bought me a present?
Uh-huh.
Why would you do such a thing?
I don't know, because it's Christmas?
Oh, Penny. I know you think you're being generous, but the foundation of gift giving is reciprocity. You haven't given me a gift. You've given me an obligation.
Don't feel bad, Penny. It's a classic rookie mistake. My first Hanukkah with Sheldon, he yelled at me for 8 nights.
Honey, it's okay. You don't have to give me anything in return.
Of course I do. The essence of the custom is that I now have to go out and purchase for you a gift of commensurate value and representing the same perceived level of friendship as that represented by the gift you've given me. Well, it's no wonder suicide rates skyrocket this time of year.
Okay, you know what? Forget it. I'm not giving you a present.
No, it's too late. I see it. That elf sticker says to Sheldon. The die has been cast. The moving finger has writ. Hannibal has crossed the Alps.
I know it's funny when it's not happening to us.
Sheldon, I am very, very sorry.
No, I brought this on myself by being such an endearing and important part of your life. I'm going to need a ride to the mall.
It's happening to us.
So basically, as demonstrated in this comic clip, social norms have evolved over time in human communities where you create these bonds among people, even when they are not genetically connected. If you do something nice for someone else, there is kind of an unspoken expectation, or if you're Sheldon, a spoken expectation that you should expect to get something in return. Now, that's kind of a callous way to put it, but the reciprocity norm is really, really essential in human societies, and it's recognized in virtually every society around the globe. Evolutionary psychologists argue that we built this sort of norm as a part of our earliest societies because it has such strong evolutionary value to us. So basically, some researchers are going to make the argument that this emotion that we call gratitude, which involves positive feelings that happen when someone helps us or does something nice for us, that positive feeling then carries over into the positive feelings we get when we give help to another person, especially when it's reciprocal. So the evolutionary argument here is that in our cultures, in our societies, we create norms, sort of rules, that help us to be helpful to others because it seals these bonds among people who have interactions with one another repeatedly.
Okay, well,
Another aspect that goes another kind of hypothesis that goes with evolutionary theory is the idea of group selection. And group selection means that even if you're not kin, if you are a part of a group, you will pretty automatically favor your group. And this has been found even in, randomly assigned groups that are formed by randomly assigning people to them. You will start to favor your own group. Now, if we're living in groups, and even if we're genetically unrelated, there tends to be a value, a survival value, in fact, of being able to work together, and that includes doing favors for each other or helping each other when we are in need. It's a kind of social contracting. So when you're dependent on other people, remember what that definition of a group was, that you are interdependent. If you're dependent on the other people in your group, one of the ways you can increase group cohesion is by being helpful to those in your group. So the evolutionary theorists here argue that people help others because it maximizes their chances of survival. So it is a survival value if in your little club you're doing things together. That means, in the image that I've chosen here, which is an example of both kin selection and group selection, in wolf packs, you tend to have interrelated groups of animals. And what they do is they hunt communally. So they will work hard to bring down prey so that they can all eat. And in fact, some of the kill will be taken back and then delivered to the members of the pack that aren't on the hunt. Now, that's a good fit for kin selection. Group selection shows up in other species. I couldn't find a handy image of that, but there are some species where you'll find large groups of unrelated individuals, but they come together at important times and they enhance each other's ability to survive. So you can have large flocks of birds, for example, and they're migrating. And part of what helps them to survive, even if they're not biologically related to one another, is that they're traveling in such a large group. And that enhances their flying capacity. It also enhances the likelihood that they'll avoid predation. So individuals, if you follow the group selection idea, individuals may behave more prosocially, even if it jeopardizes their own survival, if it maximizes the likelihood that the group is going to continue to survive. Now, it's doubly beneficial if, like with wolf packs, you have groups of genetically related individuals. Wolf packs tend to be matrilineal. They tend to have, breeding pairs that are part of them, but then you have all the juveniles, and they all tend to be related. They learn hunting skills, and they learn to hunt together, and they bring down large game only because they are working as a group. So even though that makes a lot of practical sense, group selection remains controversial among theorists for a variety of reasons that we don't need to dig into in this class, but it can be very controversial primarily because it suggests that it makes an infinite amount of sense to protect your group at the expense of perhaps other groups. So, if you look at non-human species and human species, let's be honest, let's say that your pack brings down the buffalo. Another pack may be near your territory and they're starving. You're not going to go out of your way, if you're a wolf, to make sure they get some. In fact, you'll likely attack them if they come near your prey. So there are some controversies. There's also questions about the data. And largely that comes into play when you're trying to bring the theory into the individual sphere, where you're trying to explain individual behavior. Now, moving on from evolutionary theory, let's look at more social theories, although social exchange theory, as you saw in the previous chapter on attraction, it tends to have this very calculating feel to it, because basically the idea is you're going to behave prosocially if it maximizes your rewards and minimizes your costs. So the idea behind all of social exchange theory is that what you do, whatever behavior, it's connected to your weighing costs versus benefits. And our desire is to maximize rewards, minimize costs. So the assumption is that in our relationships, we try to keep that ratio on the positive side of social rewards and avoiding social costs. So the theory is that true altruism, where you're helping people even at cost to yourself and getting no rewards, social exchange theorists are going to say, true altruism is not a thing. It just doesn't exist. So they're going to argue, yeah, prosocial behavior exists, but not true altruism, because we are always doing the math. We're always doing the calculus. So people are more likely, according to this theory, to give help when the benefits outweigh the costs for them. Now, again, this theory has kind of a callous feel to it, and I made that argument in the last chapter as well. And that's true, but there are aspects of our social behaviors, including helping behavior, that are dictated by our cost-benefit analyses. It's not all the time, but there are many situations where we kind of sit back and say, should I donate? Should I not donate? Well, what are the costs to me? Is it going to put my bank account in a real squeeze, or is it going to be fine on the cost side? What are the benefits? Am I getting some kind of token prize as a result of my contribution? Or if you're talking about more personal kinds of helping, am I going to get people's adoration or their approval if I'm helpful? Or am I going to look like an idiot by trying to help when I shouldn't? So we do that kind of analysis. There are lots of rewards of helping. The reciprocity norm really tends to show that as our cultures have evolved, we've built in a reward structure for following the reciprocity norm. When people behave nicely, when they do nice things for others, we tend to value them more. We tend to reward them. So there's a concrete kind of value system for the reciprocity norm. Helping someone is also an investment in the future. And that means if others follow the reciprocity norm, that means you're going to get help when you're in trouble, right? So if you're helpful, other people will help you, and so on and so on and so on. Helping can also help you feel less distressed. So, for example, I was on a hayride once when I was in graduate school. This is the stupidest story. But we were in a hayride. It was in the dark, and we're going down this country road. It was in Nebraska. Don't ask. And on this country road, we were traveling very slowly, and I saw off to the side of the road that there was a very large draft horse tangled up in a wire fence. And we stopped the wagon, and I was the only person on the wagon with any experience with horses, but I was also deeply distressed that this lovely Belgian draft horse was going to shred its legs on the wire, and it made me very upset. So I jump off the wagon. I could see that the farmer was on the way, but I just tried to comfort the horse. I tried to make him comfortable, and I assisted the farmer in getting the horse cut loose before we went on about our hayride. So I was very distressed by the distress of the horse, and it relieves that distress by doing something to try and be helpful. By helping others, we can also get really concrete rewards. We can get attention, approval, and that can bolster our sense of self-esteem. So remember back to those two basic motives. We want to protect our self-esteem. So in one sense, we help because it's an expectation of our inner sense of self-worth. We also may help in order to maintain cognitive consistency. if we have a value system that says being a helpful person means you're a good person, you may help in order to maintain consistency at that internal level. Now, there are also costs of not helping. If you don't help, you may be seen as a bad person or as a selfish person. You may feel like that's a cost that's too high, and so on. So all of it, we tend to spend a good chunk of our time kind of thinking through, if we have the time, thinking through what are the costs and benefits before we take action. Now, the costs of helping, just to look at these more clearly, if I go back to the hay ride example, a lot of my friends on the hay ride were like, "What are you doing? That's a 2,000-pound animal." I'm like, "It's a horse." And yeah, it was really big. But I had experience. Still, I could have been hurt. A big animal that is panicked, that's upset, could injure me. But that was part of a cost I was willing to incur. So physical danger is a cost. Pain and suffering is a cost. Anytime you donate blood, there's some pain involved. And a need to kind of refuel yourself afterwards. If you try to help and you screw up, there's the possibility of embarrassment or the possibility of making things worse. There's also your investment of time. Helping someone else means investing time. Like if there was somebody pulled over on the side of the road with a blown tire and you happen to know how to change tires, if you stop, it's going to be a solid half hour of your time before you get back on the road to wherever you're going. So there are lots of costs. Now, shifting gears a little bit away from evolutionary psychology and social exchange, we can look at, the concept of altruism a little bit differently. Batson is a researcher who's done a lot of work in this area of trying to bridge the gap between the more evolutionary oriented, the social exchange theorists, and even the behavioral theorists who argue and have argued for a long time that true altruism doesn't exist. And instead, Batson wanted to tweak things a little bit and talk about how can we explain when people are close to that altruism goal, really close to it. And what he described was something called the empathy altruism hypothesis. And basically, and this graphic kind of shows this. The illustration shows a person looking at a homeless person sitting on the sidewalk, and the text reads, observe someone in need of help. And the illustration then shows the person thinking, and the text below reads, do you feel empathy for this person? And there's two choices. If you feel empathy for them, meaning you can put yourself in their situation and imagine what it would feel like to be them. That's empathy. If you feel that empathy, you're likely to help regardless of whether it's in your self-interest. If, however, you say no, you don't feel that empathy, you can't imagine yourself in that situation, then you're likely only to help if there's a self-interested value in doing so. So let's say that you are walking by yourself and you see someone who is homeless and you don't feel direct empathy for them, but there's no one watching you, at least no one watching you who knows you. There's no payoff, so you won't help. If, however, you're walking with others who know you, even if you don't feel empathy, you may feel like there's a benefit to you being nice to the homeless person, giving them some help, because you will get approval from the people around you, right? So for Batson, he's really talking about the difference between feeling empathy for another versus paying attention to self-interest, and the way you kind of balance those off against one another. So step one is, do you feel empathy? Step two is, based on your answer, how does self-interest play in? If you feel empathy and you feel it very strongly, help is an automatic. If you feel no empathy, help still could occur, but it has to the scales have to come out in the favor of your self-interest. Now, in some of the research that Batson and his colleagues did was to look at this empathy or altruism versus self-interest, or empathy, altruism versus self-interest. So he set up a situation where this person, Carol, is shown really needing help in her intro to psych class. And they need help with note-taking. They've missed class because of an injury or something like that. And what the researchers did was to manipulate empathy. So they use a procedure where they induce empathy, encouraging people to think from the perspective of Carol. And if they do that, that tends to nurture high empathy. If it's low empathy, they're not encouraging them to think from her point of view. And that means their level of empathy is low. On the low empathy side, and then they manipulate self-interest. So are you likely to see Carol in class in the future? Because if she asks for help and you say no, knowing that she's never going to be around again, there's no self-interest motive. There's no norm of reciprocity in play. If, however, you're going to see Carol in class every day that class meets, there is self-interest that's driving you. You want to ensure that reciprocity norm is in place. So you have a dedicated self-interest. So with the blue bars here, in the low empathy condition, you don't feel empathy for her. If you are not going to have interaction with her in the future, helping is very low. So about 36, 37%. If, however, you're going to see her again, empathy goes up. And then in the high empathy condition, that's where you see the highest rates of helping. It's regardless of whether you're going to see them again. Whether you're going to see Carol again doesn't matter. So basically, feeling empathy takes self-interest off the table. And that's the key issue. When empathy is low, people are more concerned with rewards and costs. So under conditions of low empathy, social exchange matters, and the costs and benefits math matters. If, however, empathy is activated, the cost-benefit analysis becomes irrelevant for people, or at least less relevant for them. So when we're thinking about prosocial behavior, think about three basic motives for being helpful. Helping is in part an instinctive part of being alive. We are a social species. We depend on other people for our survival and our well-being. Without others, we tend not to do well. And part of the way we have evolved as a species is to ensure a certain degree of prosocial behavior in order to maximize our collective ability to survive. So that's the evolutionary point of view. Then there's also the self-interest part of the calculus, where in your immediate situation and you're deciding whether or not to behave prosocially, you're going to look at the costs and benefits. And if the math leans in the direction of helping being in your own self-interest, you're likely to help under those circumstances. And then under some conditions, when empathy is high, we tend to behave more altruistically based on the empathy altruism hypothesis. So there may still be benefits that come with the helping that we can perceive or sometimes be given. Those are less relevant in the way people are making decisions. If they are highly empathetic to the person's situation, their help tends to be non-contingent. So the person that you're helping isn't expected to do anything in return. Under low empathy conditions, go back to number 2, where you're evaluating the rewards and costs. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 11.1. In the next video, we'll be looking at Learning Objective 11.2, where we're describing the personal qualities that influence whether people will help.